Sometimes truth waits 58 years. Sometimes a single document is enough to bring down an empire. And sometimes the quietest room becomes the place where the biggest explosion happens. The manila envelope in Jasmine Crockett's hands wasn't just paper. It was the end of one of history's greatest lies. The hearing room felt different that morning. Maybe it was the way the light filtered through the tall windows of the Rayburn House office building, casting long shadows across the mahogany desks. Maybe it was the tension that had been building for weeks, ever since Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had requested this particular oversight hearing on educational integrity and federal appointments. Or maybe it was because everyone in that room, every aide, every journalist, every member of Congress, could sense that something was about to shift. Something that had been buried for nearly 6 decades was finally clawing its way to the surface. Jasmine sat at the curved committee table, her hands folded calmly over a stack of manila folders. She wore a navy blue suit that commanded respect without demanding attention, her natural hair styled in a way that framed her determined face. To anyone watching, she looked like any other representative preparing for routine questioning. But Jasmine Crockett had never been routine. 3 months earlier, she had received an unexpected phone call in her Dallas office. The voice on the other end was shaky, elderly, and carried the weight of someone who had been carrying a secret far too long. "Congresswoman Crockett? My name is Robert Steedman. I need to tell someone the truth about something that happened in 1964. The call had come at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Jasmine remembered the exact time because she had been reviewing budget appropriations for her district when her chief of staff, Marcus Williams, had knocked on her door with an expression she'd never seen before. "You need to take this call," Marcus had said simply. Robert Steedman's voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been watching you on the news, Congresswoman. The way you stand up to people who think they're untouchable, the way you don't back down when they try to intimidate you. I think you're the only person who might believe me." What followed was a conversation that would change everything. Steedman told her about his time at New York Military Academy in the early 1960s, about a fellow cadet named Donald Trump who was charming when he needed something, ruthless when he didn't get it, and absolutely terrified of academic failure. Donald wasn't stupid, Steedman had explained during that first phone call, but he wasn't the genius he pretended to be either. He was average, maybe slightly above average in some subjects, below average in others. But his father, Fred Trump, didn't accept average, not from his son. The story that unfolded over the following weeks through careful phone conversations and eventually in-person meetings painted a picture of systematic academic fraud that stretched back to Trump's teenage years. It started small. Fred Trump hiring tutors who would do more than teach. They would complete assignments. Teachers at the military academy who received generous donations to the school's athletic programs around the time grades were being finalized. Corrections to test scores that always seemed to favor young Donald. But the SAT was different. The SAT was administered by an independent organization. The SAT couldn't be bought with donations or intimidated with threats. The SAT required a different kind of solution. That solution was Robert Steedman. "I was a good kid," Steedman had told Jasmine during their second conversation. "Good grades, good family, never been in trouble. But my father had just lost his job at the shipyard, and we were behind on the rent. When Fred Trump approached me with his proposition, $1,000 might as well have been $1 million. The plan was simple in its audacity. Donald and Robert looked similar enough that with the right preparation, Robert could walk into the testing center and take the SAT under Donald's name. In 1964, photo identification wasn't required for standardized tests. A school letter and a confident manner were usually sufficient. Fred Trump had thought of everything. He arranged for Donald to be away from campus on the day of the test, a family emergency that required his immediate attention in Atlantic City. He coached Robert on Donald's mannerisms, his way of speaking, his typical confidence level. He even had Robert practice Donald's signature until it was indistinguishable from the original. What Fred Trump hadn't counted on was Robert Steedman's conscience. "I wanted to back out," Steedman had confessed to Jasmine. The night before the test, I barely slept. I kept thinking about all the other kids who would be taking their own tests, earning their own scores. It felt wrong. But my family needed that money, and Fred Trump, he wasn't the kind of man you said no to. The test day itself was a blur of anxiety and carefully controlled performance. Robert arrived at the testing center in Manhattan, presented his school letter, and signed Donald Trump's name on the registration sheet. He took the 4-hour examination, answered every question to the best of his ability, and walked out knowing he had just committed fraud. The scores, when they came back 6 weeks later, were impressive. Not perfect, but well above average. Good enough to ensure Donald's acceptance to Fordham University and later to facilitate his transfer to the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Donald was thrilled, Steedman remembered. He bragged about those scores for years. Even at our class reunions, he would bring them up. How he'd aced the test, how it proved his intellectual superiority. It made me sick every time. But what made it worse was watching Donald Trump leverage those fraudulent SAT scores into a business career and eventually into the presidency of the United States. Every time Trump boasted about his intelligence, every time he claimed intellectual superiority over his opponents, Robert Steedman felt the weight of that 60-year-old lie. I kept the money, Steedman had admitted during one of their final conversations. All these years, I kept those $100 bills in a safety deposit box. I guess part of me always knew this day would come, the day when someone would ask me to prove what I was saying. Jasmine had been methodical in her investigation. She couldn't simply take Steedman's word, no matter how compelling his story. She needed evidence. She needed documentation. She needed proof that would stand up not just to political scrutiny, but to criminal investigation. The first breakthrough came when her investigative team located the original records from New York Military Academy. The school had been reluctant to open their files, but a court order had changed their minds. Hidden in a box of administrative documents from 1964 was Donald Trump's academic file, including the notation about his absence on the SAT test date due to family emergency. The second breakthrough was even more significant. The Educational Testing Service, the organization that administered the SAT, maintained meticulous records. In their archives in Princeton, New Jersey, Jasmine's team found the original sign-in sheets from the Manhattan Testing Center on May 16, 1964. 2 signatures appeared in the space designated for Donald J. Trump. The first was hesitant, uncertain, clearly a practice attempt. The second was confident and fluid, the signature actually used during the test. Jasmine had hired 3 independent handwriting experts to analyze those signatures. All 3 reached the same conclusion. The confident signature matched known samples of Robert Steedman's handwriting from that time period. It did not match any known samples of Donald Trump's signature. The third piece of evidence was the most damaging. Fred Trump, meticulous businessman that he was, had kept records of unusual expenses. In his personal financial files, discovered during the probate of his estate, was a cash withdrawal of exactly $1,000 on May 15, 1964, one day before the SAT examination. The withdrawal slip included a handwritten notation, D's academic requirements. But the smoking gun, the piece of evidence that transformed this from a historical curiosity into a criminal matter, was the thank you note. Fred Trump had written a brief note to Robert Steedman after the SAT scores were released. Thank you for your assistance with Donald's academic requirements. Your discretion in this matter is appreciated and will be remembered. The note was signed and included an additional $200 as a bonus for exceptional performance. Robert Steedman had kept that note for 58 years. Now, as Jasmine sat in the hearing room waiting for Donald Trump to arrive, she thought about the phone call she'd received just 3 days earlier. Robert Steedman calling from his hospital bed, his voice even weaker than before. Congresswoman, the doctors say I have maybe 2 weeks. I wanted to make sure you have everything you need. I wanted to make sure the truth comes out before I'm gone. The truth. Such a simple concept, yet so rare in Washington. The committee will come to order, announced Chairman Rodriguez, gaveling the session to life. Today we examine allegations regarding academic credentials and their impact on public trust in our institutions. The hearing had been scheduled as a broad examination of educational fraud in public appointments. Jasmine had been careful not to reveal the specific nature of her evidence, knowing that any advance warning would give Trump's team time to prepare counter-narratives and legal challenges. The first witness was Dr. Michael Harrison, former admissions director at Princeton University. He spoke in careful, measured tones about the importance of standardized testing integrity, about the devastating impact of academic fraud on legitimate students, about the necessity of holding public figures to the highest standards of honesty. When we discover that someone has fraudulently obtained academic credentials, Dr. Harrison testified, it doesn't just affect that individual. It affects every student who was denied an opportunity because they couldn't compete with false scores. It undermines the integrity of the entire educational system. Jasmine listened carefully, taking notes, but her mind was on what was coming. The second witness was Professor Linda Chen from Harvard's Graduate School of Education. She spoke about the psychological impact of academic fraud, about how discovered lies could traumatize not just the perpetrators, but entire communities that had believed in them. Academic dishonesty creates a ripple effect, Professor Chen explained. When a prominent figure is revealed to have built their success on educational fraud, it can destroy public confidence in the value of honest achievement. It sends a message that cheating pays, that integrity is for suckers. During her testimony, Jasmine noticed increased activity among the security personnel near the hearing room doors. Trump was arriving. And then, at exactly 11:47 a.m., he walked in. Donald J. Trump entered the hearing room with his characteristic swagger, flanked by a small army of lawyers and advisors. He wore his trademark navy suit with the red tie, his blonde hair perfectly styled in that distinctive sweep that had become instantly recognizable around the world. His presence immediately shifted the energy in the room. Cameras that had been casually documenting the earlier testimony suddenly snapped to full attention. Journalists straightened in their seats, fingers poised over keyboards. The gallery, which had been half empty during the academic witnesses, was suddenly packed with spectators. Trump took his place at the witness table with a confident smile, adjusting his tie and looking around the room like he owned it, which, in many ways, he believed he did. "Mr. Trump," Chairman Rodriguez began, "thank you for appearing before this committee. As you know, we're examining questions that have been raised about academic credentials in relation to public service." Trump leaned into the microphone, his voice carrying that familiar tone of absolute certainty. "Happy to be here, Congressman, though I have to say I'm not sure why we're wasting time on this. My academic record speaks for itself. Always has. I mean, I went to Wharton. That's the best business school in the world. They don't just let anyone in there." Representative Johnson, a Republican from Ohio, asked the first question. "Mr. Trump, can you describe your educational background for the committee?" Trump's face lit up. This was his favorite subject. "Well, I started at Fordham University, which is a tremendous school. But after 2 years, I transferred to the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And let me tell you, that's not easy to do. Wharton is incredibly selective. You have to be really smart to get in there." He warmed to his theme, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of someone who had told this story countless times. "Before that, I was at New York Military Academy, where I was a tremendous student. Great grades, great scores on everything. I was always at the top of my class." Representative Martinez, a Democrat from California, followed up. "Mr. Trump, what role did standardized test scores play in your college admissions?" "Huge role," Trump responded immediately. "I mean, back then, the SATs were really important. Not like today where they've been dumbed down. Back in my day, they were serious tests that separated the smart kids from everyone else." Jasmine felt her pulse quicken. He was walking directly into the trap. "And how did you perform on those tests?" Martinez continued. Trump puffed up visibly. "Incredible scores, really incredible. I mean, I don't want to brag, but they were some of the highest scores the testing center had ever seen. The proctor even commented on it. She said in all her years of administering these tests, She'd rarely seen someone finish as quickly as I did with such high accuracy. Jasmine made a note. Trump was providing details that could be checked, verified, or in this case, directly contradicted by eyewitness testimony. Representative Williams from Texas took the next question. Mr. Trump, some critics have suggested that your academic achievements were overstated. How do you respond to such allegations? Trump's demeanor shifted slightly, the genial confidence giving way to a familiar edge of irritation. That's fake news, Congressman. Total fake news. These are the same people who've been trying to tear me down for years. They can't stand that someone like me, someone who achieved so much, came from where I came from. He leaned forward, his voice taking on that prosecutorial tone that had become his trademark. You know what the real crime is here? The real crime is that we're wasting time on this nonsense when we should be talking about the real problems facing this country. My academic record is spotless, always has been. I was a great student, I got great scores, and I went to great schools. Several other committee members asked preliminary questions, all of which Trump answered with his usual blend of self-promotion and deflection. He talked about his time at Fordham, describing it as 2 tremendous years where I made a huge impact. He discussed his transfer to Wharton as one of the most competitive academic moves anyone had ever made. And then he said the words that Jasmine had been waiting for. You know, people always ask me about my intelligence. They want to know how I got to where I am. Well, I can tell you this. I've always been a winner when it comes to tests. Always. The SATs? Aced them. Every test I ever took, I was at the top of the class. It's just natural ability, you know? Some people have it, some people don't. Jasmine's pen stopped moving across her notepad. I remember taking those SATs back in '64, Trump continued, warming to his favorite subject, himself. Beautiful test. I mean, I destroyed that test. The scores were incredible. Probably some of the highest scores they'd ever seen at that testing center. The proctor even commented on it. She said she'd never seen anyone work through the problem so quickly and confidently. A small smile played at the corner of Jasmine's mouth. Trump was providing specific details about an experience he'd never had, describing conversations with a proctor he'd never met. And you know what the beautiful thing is? Trump went on, completely unaware that he was stepping deeper into quicksand with every word. Back then, there was no prep course nonsense, no tutors, no fancy consultants telling you how to game the system. You either had it or you didn't. And I had it. Natural talent. You can't fake that kind of intelligence. The irony was stunning. Here was a man whose entire SAT experience had been based on elaborate preparation, coaching, and what amounted to professional test-taking services, claiming that he'd succeeded through natural ability alone. The test was 4 hours long, Trump continued, apparently unable to stop himself from embellishing. 4 grueling hours. But I finished early. Finished with time to spare. The proctor, Mrs. Dot. He paused, clearly trying to remember a name he'd never actually learned. Mrs. Vasquez, Jasmine said quietly. Trump looked at her in surprise. What? The proctor's name was Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez. She's 87 years old now, and she still lives in Manhattan. She remembers that day very clearly. The room suddenly felt different. The casual atmosphere of routine congressional testimony had shifted into something more focused, more dangerous. Trump's confident smile wavered slightly. Yes, that's right. Mrs. Vasquez, lovely woman, very professional. Jasmine slowly reached for the manila envelope that had been sitting beside her notepad throughout the morning's testimony. Mr. Trump, I'd like to ask you about some specific details regarding your SAT experience. Trump's lawyers were now paying closer attention, leaning forward in their seats behind the witness table. Sure, Trump said, his voice carrying just a hint of uncertainty for the first time that morning. Jasmine opened the manila envelope with deliberate care, her movements slow and methodical. She was building tension, creating the kind of dramatic moment that would capture every camera in the room. Mr. Trump, you testified that you took the SAT examination in 1964. You described finishing early, achieving incredible scores, and impressing the proctor with your natural ability. Is that correct? That's absolutely correct, Trump replied, though some of his earlier bravado had faded. And you accomplished all of this through your own natural intelligence, without any outside assistance? Natural talent, Trump confirmed. You can't teach that kind of ability. Jasmine nodded slowly, pulling the first document from the envelope. Mr. Trump, I want to show you something. She held up Robert Steedman's sworn affidavit, the document that had taken months to obtain and verify. This is a sworn statement from Mr. Robert Steedman of Queens, New York. Mr. Steedman is 82 years old and currently receiving hospice care for terminal pancreatic cancer. Trump's lawyers immediately began whispering urgently in his ear, but Trump shrugged them off, his attention focused entirely on the document in Jasmine's hands. In this statement, Jasmine continued, her voice steady and clear, Mr. Steedman describes being approached by your father, Fred Trump, in the spring of 1964. According to Mr. Steedman, your father offered him $1,000 in cash to impersonate you during the SAT examination. The room erupted. Camera flashes went off like strobes. Journalists began frantically typing on their phones and laptops. The gallery buzzed with shocked whispers. Trump's face went through a remarkable transformation, from confusion to anger to something approaching panic. That's ridiculous, Trump sputtered, his voice rising above the chaos. That's a complete lie. I don't even know who this Steedman person is. This is obviously another fake news hit job. Jasmine waited for the noise to die down before continuing. She had anticipated this response and was prepared for it. Mr. Trump, you say you don't know Robert Steedman. Let me show you another document. She pulled out a photograph from the 1963 New York Military Academy yearbook. The image was enlarged and enhanced, showing 2 rows of young cadets in their dress uniforms. This is a photograph from your 1963 yearbook at New York Military Academy. Front row, 3rd from the left, that's you, Mr. Trump. And right next to you, front row, 4th from the left, that's Robert Steedman. The photograph was damning evidence in itself. The 2 young men looked remarkably similar. Same height, same basic build, same general facial structure. While they were clearly 2 different people, the resemblance was close enough that one could easily impersonate the other in a situation where detailed identification wasn't required. Mr. Steedman was your classmate, Mr. Trump. According to the Academy's records, you lived in the same dormitory, attended the same classes, and participated in many of the same activities. Multiple witness statements from your other classmates confirm that you and Mr. Steedman were well acquainted. Trump was visibly sweating now, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. This is obviously a political hit job. This is exactly the kind of fake news witch hunt that the radical left Democrats have been running for years. They'll do anything to try to bring me down. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She had spent months building this case, gathering evidence, verifying facts. She wasn't going to let Trump deflect his way out of this. Mr. Trump, she said, her voice cutting through his protests like a blade through silk. Are you familiar with 18 U.S.C. section 1341? Trump's lawyers were now in full panic mode, whispering desperately in his ear, making urgent gestures for him to stop talking. But Trump, in his characteristic fashion, couldn't help himself. I don't know what numbers you're talking about, he snapped. What I know is that I took my own test, I got perfect scores, and this is obviously just another attempt to mail fraud, Mr. Trump. Jasmine's words cut through his rambling with surgical precision. 18 U.S.C. section 1341 makes it a federal crime to use the Postal Service in furtherance of a fraudulent scheme. When false SAT scores are transmitted through the mail to universities as part of an admissions application, that constitutes mail fraud. The legal implications were beginning to dawn on everyone in the room. This wasn't just about academic dishonesty anymore. This was about federal criminal law. Jasmine pulled out the 3rd document, the test center sign-in sheet that her team had obtained from the Educational Testing Service archives. This is the original sign-in sheet from the ETS testing center in Manhattan, dated May 16, 1964, the day you claim to have destroyed the SAT. She held up the document for the cameras, pointing to the relevant section with a laser pointer. Here, we see the space designated for Donald J. Trump, and here, we see two signatures in that space. The enlarged photograph showed the evidence clearly. The first signature appears to be a practice attempt, uncertain, hesitant, clearly someone trying to mimic an unfamiliar signature. The second signature, the one actually used during the test registration, has been analyzed by 3 independent handwriting experts from the FBI's forensic laboratory. She paused for dramatic effect, letting the weight of federal involvement sink in. All 3 experts confirmed that the second signature matches known samples of Robert Steedman's handwriting from that time period. It does not match any known samples of your handwriting, Mr. Trump. The silence in the room was deafening. Even Trump seemed momentarily at a loss for words, his usual verbal agility completely abandoned. But Jasmine still wasn't finished. Mr. Trump, you mentioned Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, the test proctor. We found her. She's 87 years old and lives in a retirement community on the Upper East Side. Her memory is still sharp, and she remembers that day very clearly. Jasmine pulled out a transcript of her interview with the former proctor. According to Mrs. Vasquez, the young man who took the test under your name was nervous, polite, and kept checking his watch. She noticed this because it was unusual. Most students taking the SAT were focused entirely on the test itself. She looked up at Trump, whose face had gone pale. She also remembers that this young man had a slight Queens accent, which she found odd because your school records indicated you were from Jamaica Estates in Queens, but you had always spoken with what she described as a more refined accent during your previous interactions with Academy staff. But the detail she remembers most clearly, Jasmine continued, is what happened after the test. The young man thanked her profusely, shook her hand, and said something that stuck with her for all these years. He said, "I hope I did right by him." Trump's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he appeared to be completely without words. Mrs. Vasquez found this comment strange at the time, but she assumed it referred to a father or teacher who had prepared the student. She had no idea that him referred to an entirely different person. Jasmine pulled out another document. This is Mrs. Vasquez's sworn statement given just last week. She has positively identified Robert Steedman from photographs as the young man who took the SAT under your name in 1964. The room was in chaos now. Reporters were standing, trying to get better angles for their cameras. The gallery was buzzing with shocked conversation. Chairman Rodriguez was gaveling for order, but the noise was overwhelming. Through it all, Trump sat in stunned silence, his lawyers frantically scribbling notes and whispering among themselves. But Jasmine had saved the most damaging evidence for last. "Mr. Trump, there's one more piece of evidence I'd like to share with the committee." She reached into the envelope and pulled out a plastic evidence bag containing what appeared to be old currency and a handwritten note. "Mr. Steedman kept the payment he received from your father. For 58 years, he's preserved these 10 $100 bills in a safety deposit box, along with a note of thanks from Fred Trump." She held up the evidence bag for the cameras. "The bills have been tested by the Treasury Department's forensic laboratory. They are genuine 1964 series currency, and the serial numbers confirm they were distributed to banks in the New York area during that time period. But more importantly," she continued, "here is the note that accompanied the payment." She displayed an enlarged photograph of the handwritten note. It reads, "Robert, thank you for your assistance with Donald's academic requirements. Your discretion in this matter is appreciated and will be remembered. With gratitude, Fred Trump." The room erupted again, but this time the chaos felt different. This wasn't just shock. This was the sound of a scandal reaching critical mass. The handwriting on this note has been verified by the same FBI forensic experts who analyzed the test signatures. It matches samples of your father's handwriting from business documents filed in New York during the same time period. Trump finally found his voice, but it came out as a strangled shout. This is a setup. This is exactly the kind of corrupt partisan witch hunt that the American people are sick of. You people will do anything to try to bring me down. Jasmine remained perfectly calm, her voice cutting through his protests with quiet authority. Mr. Trump, I'll ask you again. Did you personally take the SAT examination on May 16, 1964? I already answered that question. Actually, Mr. Trump, you didn't. You deflected and made accusations, but you didn't answer the direct question. She gestured toward the evidence displayed around the hearing room. Given the evidence I've just presented, Mr. Steedman's sworn affidavit, the yearbook photograph showing your relationship with him, the handwriting analysis of the test signatures, Mrs. Vasquez's eyewitness testimony, your father's thank you note, and the academy records showing you as absent on the test date. Do you still maintain that you personally took this examination? Trump looked around the room wildly, as if searching for an escape route. His lawyers were making frantic cutting motions across their throats, clearly wanting him to invoke his Fifth Amendment rights and stop talking. But Trump had never been able to back down from a challenge, especially when it was being broadcast live to the nation. Those documents could be fake, he protested weakly. That Steedman guy, maybe he's being paid to lie. Maybe he's got dementia. Maybe the Democrats got to him. Mr. Trump, Jasmine's voice was steady, relentless. Mr. Steedman is dying. He has no political affiliations, no financial motivations, and no reason to lie. He simply wants to clear his conscience before he passes away. She gestured toward the evidence again. These documents have been authenticated by multiple independent experts. The handwriting analysis has been verified by FBI forensic specialists. The currency has been tested by Treasury Department experts. Mrs. Vasquez's testimony has been corroborated by other Academy staff who worked there in 1964. More importantly, she continued, everything Mr. Steedman described can be independently verified. He described the specific testing center layout, correct. He described paying for lunch afterward at a deli across the street. That deli was indeed there in 1964, exactly where he said it was. He described the weather that day, overcast with light rain in the afternoon, which matches meteorological records for May 16, 1964. She paused, letting the weight of corroborating evidence settle over the room. Mr. Trump, we also have your own words working against you. In a 1987 interview with Playboy magazine, you said, and I quote, I was always good at tests, but I remember being really nervous about the SATs. They were so important for getting into college. She pulled out a copy of the magazine article. But today, under oath, you've testified that you felt completely confident, that you finished early, that you weren't nervous at all. Your own previous statements contradict your testimony here today. And in your 1997 book, The Art of the Comeback, you wrote about the importance of preparation for major tests. You specifically mentioned hiring tutors and spending months preparing for important examinations. Yet today you've testified that you succeeded on the SATs through natural ability alone, without any preparation. The contradictions were piling up, each one making Trump's position more untenable. Furthermore, Jasmine continued, your academic transcript from New York Military Academy shows significant improvement in your grades during your final semester, the same semester when the SAT was taken. Your English grades jumped from C+ to A-. Your mathematics grades improved from B- to A. This dramatic improvement occurred precisely during the period when Mr. Steedman says he was providing you with academic assistance. Trump was now slumped in his chair, the fight seeming to drain out of him as the evidence mounted. But perhaps most telling of all, Jasmine said, pulling out one final document, is this letter from the admissions office at Fordham University, dated June 15, 1964. She held up the letter for the cameras. This letter congratulates you on your acceptance to Fordham and specifically mentions your impressive SAT scores as a key factor in their decision. The letter references a combined score of 1420, excellent for 1964 standards. However, Mr. Trump, here's what makes this letter so significant. The letterhead includes a small notation at the bottom. SAT scores verified through direct communication with Educational Testing Service. This means Fordham actually called ETS to confirm your scores. She paused dramatically. When our investigators contacted ETS and requested the call logs from that time period, they found the record of Fordham's verification call. But here's the interesting part. The ETS representative who took that call made a notation in their logbook. It says, "Unusual case. Test taker appeared nervous and asked multiple questions about score reporting procedures." That ETS representative, Mr. Trump, was describing Robert Steedman's behavior on test day. Mr. Steedman was nervous because he was committing fraud. He was asking questions about score reporting because he needed to understand how the false scores would be transmitted to colleges. The hearing room was completely silent now. Even the reporters had stopped typing, transfixed by the methodical destruction of Trump's testimony. "Mr. Trump," Jasmine said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had built an unshakable case. "The statute of limitations for mail fraud is normally 5 years. However, when fraud is committed in connection with a federal benefit, such as admission to a university that receives federal funding, that limitation can be extended under certain circumstances. More importantly," she continued, "there is no statute of limitations on the crime of perjury before Congress. You have testified, under oath, before this committee that you personally took the SAT examination in 1964. The evidence I've presented proves conclusively that this testimony is false." She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the tone that every prosecutor in the room recognized. It was the voice of someone who had their opponent completely cornered. "Mr. Trump, I'm giving you one final opportunity to correct your testimony before we proceed further. Did you personally take the SAT examination on May 16, 1964? But she found herself thinking about the bigger picture, about all the lies that powerful people told, confident that they would never be held accountable, about all the truths that remained buried because the people who knew them were too afraid or too powerless to speak up. The Trump SAT scandal would dominate headlines for weeks, maybe months. There would be criminal investigations, congressional hearings, political ramifications that would ripple through the next election cycle and beyond. But for Jasmine, the real victory was simpler than that. It was the knowledge that when truth and lies faced off in the bright lights of a congressional hearing room, truth had won. Not through shouting or grandstanding or political theater, but through careful investigation, meticulous documentation, and the courage of one dying man who decided that his conscience mattered more than his comfort. The manila envelope that had started it all was now in the hands of federal prosecutors. Robert Steedman's 58-year secret was now front-page news around the world, and Donald Trump's claims of intellectual superiority were now widely recognized as the lies they had always been. Sometimes truth waits 58 years. Sometimes a single document is enough to bring down an empire. And sometimes the quietest room becomes the place where the biggest explosion happens. But the most important truth of all was this. In America, justice might be delayed, but it doesn't have to be denied. Not when there are people willing to fight for it. As Jasmine finally turned off the lights in her office and headed home, she carried with her the satisfaction of knowing that today, truth had triumphed over power. Today, an old lie had finally been exposed to the light. And tomorrow, the real work would begin. The truth doesn't need to shout to shake foundations. It just needs someone brave enough to speak it. Robert Steedman waited 58 years to tell his story, but when he finally found the right person to tell it to, that story changed everything. If this investigation reminded you why accountability matters, why no one should be above the truth, hit that like button and subscribe to Scale of Justice. We believe that lies, no matter how old or how carefully buried, cannot hide forever. Ring that notification bell, because when the next buried truth surfaces, you'll want to be there to witness it. What secret truth do you think needs to be exposed? What lie has been hiding in plain sight for too long? Share your thoughts in the comments below. But remember, we're not here to spread conspiracy theories. We're here to celebrate the power of evidence, investigation, and the courage to speak truth to power. Let's not just watch history unfold. Let's learn from it. And let's never forget that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can carry into a room is the truth dressed like a whisper.